Andy Warhol was born André Arjola Jr. in 1928 in a working-class suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Slovakia. Andy was the youngest of their 3 sons. Julia Arjola, Andy's mother, didn't want to learn English, so they spoke a Slovakian dialect at home. As a child, illness kept Andy from attending school, so he would read comics and Hollywood magazines instead. He finally started school in 1934, in the 2nd grade, at the age of 7. When Andy was 17, he attended college at the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh. In 1949, he gained a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in pictorial design. His plan was to become a commercial artist. While he was at college, Andy painted this picture of the living room of his Pittsburgh home. This is where Andy Warhol came from. Warhol arrived in New York City in 1949. Looking for a way to get hired as a commercial artist, he began knocking on doors. On his 2nd day, he approached Tina Fredericks, a well-known art director of Glamour magazine. She told him that she was looking for drawings of shoes, and that she needed them by the following morning. The next day, after seeing his work, she hired him on the spot. His first illustration appeared in the magazine's September issue, showing the ladder to success in New York City. By accident, the credit read Drawings by Andy Warhol, without the A at the end. From then on, Andy used the new spelling as his last name. One commission led to another, and Warhol was soon in high demand as an illustrator for prestigious clients, including the New York Times, Vogue, Bonwit Teller, and Harper's Bazaar. Before long, his list of clients grew to include record labels and high-end retailers, such as Tiffany & Company, Bourjois Perfume, Fleming-Joff, and, most notably, Miller Shoes. By 1955, Warhol was the sole illustrator for prestigious ads for Miller Shoes. From then until 1960, Warhol produced some 300 illustrations of women's shoes for Miller Shoes, including a series of full-page ads that would regularly appear in the Sunday New York Times. During this period, Warhol created everything from charming drawings of shoes, hats, flowers, and cats, to iconic illustrations of cars, cosmetics and glitzy celebrity portraits. Warhol's first fine art exhibition was in 1952 at the Hugo Gallery in New York. It was called 15 Drawings based on the writings of Truman Capote. Capote's first book, Other Voices, Other Rooms, was published in 1948, when Warhol was still at college. 2 months prior to Warhol's exhibit at the Hugo Gallery, Capote's play, The Grass Harp, had premiered on Broadway, with sets and costumes designed by Cecil Beaton. When Warhol was a teenager, he had an obsession with Truman Capote. He used to write to him from Pittsburgh. When he arrived in New York, he would stand outside Capote's house all day, waiting for him to come out. Capote said it nearly drove him crazy. Capote would have nothing to do with Warhol, and called him a window dresser and a loser. Much later on, they became friends. That was after Warhol had become a celebrity. In 1952, Andy's mother moved to New York City to live with her son. Julia was an artist in her own right. Her favorite things to draw were cats and angels. Julia worked with Andy to add her delicate penmanship to hundreds of his commercial drawings. These included advertisements, album covers, and book illustrations. In 1957, Warhol published a book of Julia's drawings. It was called Holy Cats, by Andy Warhol's mother. The Cat Book was a joint production in which Andy and his mother did the drawings, and others did the words and the coloring. 150 cat books were printed in black ink, and colored by hand. Andy used them as gifts to promote his commercial business. Warhol published a series of artists' books in the 1950s. He held parties at Serendipity 3, a restaurant and ice cream parlor, on Manhattan's Upper East Side, where his friends would help him hand-color his books. In the 50s, Warhol experimented with methods of producing images that did not rely on drawing, such as photostat copying and the opaque projector. He used these techniques in his commercial designs, and also in his fine art. An example is Two Heads, painted in 1957, showing two men kissing. The background is stenciled. The imagery is similar to his Rorschach ink blot paintings that he would produce 30 years later. In the 1950s, even though Warhol was considered to be more of an illustrator than an artist, he was already beginning to use the artistic techniques that would appear later in his more mature work. A key figure in Warhol's life at this time was the successful New York fashion photographer Otto Fehn. By the time Fehn and Warhol became friends in 1951, Fehn had established a large photographic studio on Manhattan's East Side. The Otto Fehn studio attracted creative gay men from the worlds of fashion, dance, and theater, making it irresistible to Warhol, who loved the glitz and glamour of the studio life. Now and then, Fehn would dress up in drag. He would put on wigs, strands of pearls, fishnet stockings, and take scores of photographs of himself in outrageous poses. He hosted private parties, with guests dressed in drag, or black tie, all dancing together. It was at this time that Warhol did some of his earliest drawings of a man in drag, when he sketched Otto Fehn, dressed as a woman. Throughout the 50s, the two artists became creative collaborators. Warhol posed for Fehn's photo portraits, while Fehn experimented with projections of Warhol's drawings of flowers and butterflies onto the faces of his models. Warhol drew backdrops for Fehn's fashion shoots and created a series of drawings of men in drag based on photographs taken by Fehn. Warhol's drawings were often of men. He didn't hesitate to show two men kissing or, it is said, to ask nearly any man he met if he could draw him nude. The resulting pictures and drawings made his artwork unacceptable to mainstream audiences at the time. Galleries refused to display it, considering that homosexuality was against the law in the United States. In the 1950s, and, certainly not accepted, in the New York art world, Warhol was remarkably open about being gay. While details of his sexuality are frequently suppressed today, Warhol had several male partners throughout his life. These colleagues and collaborators helped to shape and define Warhol's career as an artist. In 1956, Warhol finally presented a solo exhibition of his work at New York's Bodley Gallery, called Studies for a Boy Book. These sketchbook portraits of young men, and erotic portrayals of male nudes, contrasted with the work of other gay artists working at the same time. They considered Warhol's work too risque to be exhibited. For them, gay subjects were fine in private, but they did not want the public to associate art with being gay, in case it impacted the success of their own work in the art world. Reviewers criticized Warhol's Studies for a Boy book drawings for their doubtful taste and their private meaning. They referred to them as highly suggestive. But Warhol, who was an ambitious and eager artist, wanting desperately to succeed, was undeterred. He continued to produce artworks, and to hold gallery showings, where he could, throughout the 50s. At the same time, he continued to take on commercial clients to finance his art projects. Such was his success, that he won the American Institute of Graphic Art Award in 1954, and also the Art Directors Award in 1952, 56 and 57. Just over a month after his first showing at the Bodley Gallery closed, one of Warhol's shoe drawings was included in a group show at the Museum of Modern Art, called Recent Drawings, USA. In 1961, Warhol was commissioned, for the first time, by the department store Bonwit Teller, to create displays for its windows on Fifth Avenue. Warhol hung 5 of his paintings behind department store models in the window. The paintings were based on comic strips and newspaper advertisements. The stylishly dressed mannequins in front played directly with the idea of art as advertising. That made him a lot of money. However, he stopped producing cartoon art after seeing Roy Lichtenstein's pop art. These were the years when Warhol hung around at the edges of the New York fine art scene, which was still under the spell of high-minded abstract expressionists, such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. At the same time, so-called pop art, which began in Britain in the mid-50s, began to challenge the traditions of fine art, by including imagery from popular and mass culture, such as advertising, comic books and other cultural objects. Artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg emerged as forces in the American art scene. Johns' paintings of maps, flags, and targets led the artistic community away from abstract expressionism toward a new emphasis on reality, laying the groundwork for both pop art and minimalism in America. Andy Warhol had arrived in New York with only $200 in his pocket and slept for years with his mother next to him on 2 mattresses on the floor. Now, as a commercial artist, Warhol was earning up to $100,000 a year, a staggering sum for the 1950s. By 1959 he had paid $67,000 for a townhouse near the new Guggenheim Museum. It was referred to by his friends as the townhouse bought by shoe ads. Everything Andy owned was paid for with an endless flow of $100 drawings of shoes, hats, scarves, perfumes, handbags, and other ladies' accessories. He continued to live at this address, with his mother, Julia, and her cats, for decades after buying it. As the 50s gave way to the 60s, and his commercial hand-drawn illustrations were replaced by professional photography, Warhol decided to give up his commercial business to follow his fine art aspirations. From then on, he continued to take on commercial clients, but on a more casual basis. Today, Warhol is perhaps best known for his Campbell's soup can paintings. In 1961, Warhol supposedly paid a friend $50 for the idea. He was advised to paint a subject that everyone would recognize. The friend suggested something like a can of Campbell's soup. Warhol immediately went to the supermarket and stocked up on soup cans. Though the works resemble mass-produced advertisements, they were created by projecting the images onto the canvas, and then tracing and hand-painting each one separately. Warhol wanted viewers to look at the constant repetition of the cans, and to see their uniformity, rather than see any meaning in an individual can. Warhol's soup can paintings influence pop art in 2 ways. Firstly, he used a common object as his subject. Before Warhol, painting commonplace things was unheard of. After the creation of this work, everybody did it. Since Warhol, artists have moved away from considering what could, or could not, be portrayed in a work of art. Secondly, he challenged the question of what can be defined as art. Early critics of the work thought it didn't count as art, and one gallery manager stacked up some cans at his gallery, saying that his stack was worth more than the value Warhol's paintings. Art after Warhol is unique, when compared to other art periods, in that it challenged the essence of what is defined as art. When Warhol produced the original Campbell's paintings in the 1960s, they were seen as a powerful statement on the boring repetition of advertising. 20 years later, many critics felt this imagery had lost its edge, and that Warhol had sold out. Warhol disagreed. He argued that, throughout his career, he was always a commercial artist. In 1962, Warhol had his first major exhibition at the Ferris Gallery, in Los Angeles. Time, Life and Newsweek magazines ran articles about the show. Today, the complete set of 32 Soupcan paintings from that exhibit can be seen at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Warhol painted the cans and newspaper headlines in 1961 by hand, but, in late 1962, he found out how to transfer a picture photographically onto a silk screen for printing. He immediately switched to this technique, eliminating all traces of the artist's hand, and producing something he was searching for, a more mechanically detached picture. In 1963, Warhol employed an assistant to work full-time screen printing for him. Gradually, other assistants joined the payroll. Using this method, Warhol would go on to create celebrity portraits of the stars, including Elizabeth Taylor, Elvis Presley, and Jackie Kennedy. Screen printing allowed him to directly reproduce images already in the public eye, such as publicity shots or newspaper photographs. Using the photographic technique, he could easily produce multiple versions and variations of the same image. When Warhol started work on his Marilyn Monroe series, his assistants performed most of the work. Warhol made a deliberate point of his non-involvement, believing that someone else should be able to do the mechanics of printing and paintings for him. To Warhol, the essential idea was that content mattered more than style. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962 from an overdose of barbiturates. In the following 4 months, Warhol made more than 20 screen prints of her, all based on the same publicity photograph from her 1953 film, Niagara. This picture is perhaps one of Warhol's most iconic works. It was exhibited in his first New York exhibition in 1962 at the Stable Gallery. The work is made up of 2 canvases, each featuring 25 images of Marilyn, printed in a grid pattern. The 2 contrasting sides of this work are said to capture the difference between Marilyn's artificial public persona, on the left, and the harsh reality of her troubled private life, on the right. The Monroe pictures are considered to be a fusion of 2 of Warhol's consistent themes, death and the cult of the celebrity. The mechanical repetition makes Marilyn seem superficial, denying her any individuality beyond that of a surface image. The result could be considered a frightening depersonalization of a human being, and perhaps reflects the artist's own image of himself. As late as 1975, Warhol wrote, "I am still haunted by the idea of looking into a mirror and seeing no one, nothing at all." It was not until 1963, and the assassination of the president, John F. Kennedy in Texas, that Warhol reached maturity as a pop artist. Like the rest of America, Warhol was stunned by the media spectacle sparked by the death of the president. He decided to use this event as a subject for his paintings. He used newspaper and magazine images of Jackie Kennedy, published by the press, to cover the murder of JFK. He repeated the images in the artwork over and over again as a metaphor for how the news media works, saturating its audience with pictures and words, until we are programmed to think and feel in a certain way. The Jackie paintings are important, because for the first time Warhol, the artist, was making pictures from newspaper and magazine images. He was using the news as his subject. His images of Marilyn Monroe and other celebrities in his pictures remain some of his most parodied works. A collection of paintings of Monroe that had been shot at with a gun by one of Warhol's factory assistants would go on to become particularly valuable. And one of the paintings in the collection, Turquoise Marilyn, would sell for $80 million in 2007. From then on, Warhol painted celebrity portraits in vivid and garish colors. His most famous subjects include Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, Liza Minnelli and Mao Zedong. As these portraits gained fame and notoriety, Warhol began to receive hundreds of commissions for portraits from socialites and celebrities. His picture 8 Elvises eventually resold for $100 million in 2008, making it one of the most valuable paintings in world history. The images of his female subjects are among Warhol's most striking. Many believe they are also sexist. The emphasis is on the lips, hair, and eyeshadow, making sitters, including Liz Taylor, Diana Ross, and Jackie Kennedy, appear one-dimensional and superficial. As personalities, they were anything but. Some have suggested Warhol was making them into drag queens, or a caricature of a woman. While Warhol may have delved into these women's darkness and the sorrow surrounding them, the artist was unashamedly obsessed with beauty and how to capture it. While he switched his affections frequently and was often accused of being cold or removed, claims of cruelty in Warhol's attempts to control women are wide of the mark. Close female relationships were incredibly important to Warhol, right up until his death in 1987, a death that devastated many of his closest female friends. He was a conflicted person, confirms a friend. I never believed that Warhol was evil, but I do think he was a psychologically complex and scarred human being. One art critic believed that the cold Warhol was simply a persona he adopted for show. He was happy for people to see him as a completely robotic character, with no compassion. But it's clear that this was just a facade. He was not just coldly interested in his subjects, his art is full of soul and poetry. And that goes for the way he depicts women too. He was clearly fascinated with women, both in his art and in his personal life. And none of these relationships were black or white. Typically for Andy Warhol, they were rather more colorful. The factory was where Warhol, with an army of assistants, produced his paintings, and where he shot films, hosted parties, and held the occasional rally. In establishing the factory, he built a freewheeling, underground art scene in New York that was initially quite successful. The factory was the hip hangout for artistic types, amphetamine users, and the Warhol superstars. In the factory, Warhol's workers would make silkscreens and lithographs under his direction. By the time Warhol had achieved a reputation, he was working day and night on his paintings. Warhol manufactured up to 80 silk-screened paintings per day, and, at one point, a film every week. To increase production, he made use of a group of adult film performers, drag queens, socialites, drug addicts, musicians, and free thinkers, who became known as the Warhol superstars. These art workers helped him create his paintings, starred in his films, and created the atmosphere for which the factory became legendary. Warhol achieved stardom, and through his work, helped others to do the same. In 1962, Warhol met his friend, Metropolitan Museum of Art curator Henry Geldzahler, who advised him that he should move beyond cans of soup and Coke bottles as subjects. "That's enough life," he said, "it's time for a little death." Geldzahler pushed him to engage with more serious subject matter, which led Warhol to create some of the most powerful artwork of his career. He had embarked on what would later be known as his Death and Disaster series. Warhol appropriated source material from newspapers and police photo archives, and used silkscreen printing as a means to mechanically repeat these lurid images across his canvases. He started with the monumental 129 dye and jet, in which he transferred an image from the New York Mirror newspaper, by means of an opaque projector, to his canvas. It was traced and painted by hand. Over the next few years, Warhol created a gripping series of gruesome paintings that used published images of death and disaster. These images are disturbing, not only because of their horrifying explicitness, but also because Warhol's detachment suggests an emotional void, said to reflect the alienation of life in the 60s. Silver Car Crash is the painting in this series that achieved the highest earnings of all of Warhol's work. It sold for $105 million in 2013, surpassing the record set previously by his painting 8 Elvises. The repeated images of the crash are to the left of a blank silver canvas, which creates a sense of emptiness. Perhaps representing the empty feeling one might experience when confronting death. The painting has a cinematic feel about it, the use of silver and black, making it look like a film strip. Apart from Silver Car Crash, which has been in the same private collection since 1988, all of the other large-scale disaster paintings are in prestigious museum collections, owing, no doubt, to their importance to 20th-century art. For each museum, these works serve as important cornerstones of their pop art holdings. The electric chair series of prints are derived from a photograph of the electric chair at Sing Sing Penitentiary, where the convicted Soviet spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, had been executed in 1953, at the height of the Cold War. Warhol created roughly 40 versions of electric chair, mostly produced in black ink, applied over colored bases, from silver to the bright colors seen here. Each of these evocative and haunting canvases are identical in size and subject matter, with varying degrees of black ink saturation. Some view Warhol's Death and Disaster series and his Marilyn pictures as expressions of his sorrow at public events. Others view them as some of the first examples of compassion fatigue, showing the way the public loses the ability to sympathize with events from which they feel removed. Apart from his pictures, Warhol's range as an artist certainly shows in his sculptures and installations, some of which replicated commercial product packaging. Warhol first began making box sculptures in 1963. He created a factory assembly line and used his studio assistants to create hundreds of replicas of large supermarket product boxes. These included Brillo boxes, Heinz boxes, Del Monte boxes, and others. The finished sculptures were nearly indistinguishable from their cardboard supermarket counterparts. Perhaps his best-known sculpture from this series is his Brillo boxes. As the name suggests, Warhol applied silk-screened logos of the product onto painted plywood boxes. These sculptures were first exhibited at the Stable Gallery in 1964, and called into question what can be considered fine art. Overall, his sculptural works revolved around Warhol's idea of mixing commercialism and art. Warhol's largest mural was designed to hang on the outside of a circular cinema, 30 meters in diameter. 13 Most Wanted Men was created for the New York State Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair in New York, and was intended to depict something to do with New York. Warhol printed large-scale copies of images from a New York Police Department booklet published in 1962, entitled The 13 Most Wanted. The mural was created and screen-printed onto hardboard panels. The completed 6 meters by 6 meters square work was installed at the site. 2 weeks before the fair was due to open, local government officials objected to the images. The governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, was concerned that the pictures, mostly showing men of Italian descent, would be insulting to an important segment of his electorate. Finally, Warhol gave his permission for it to be overpainted, and it was obliterated with aluminium house paint before the fair opened to the public. One of New York's most prestigious galleries of postmodernist art was owned by Leo Castelli. Warhol had always wanted to have a solo exhibition there, and Castelli finally gave him one in 1964. His first show was Flowers, in which Warhol moved further away from naturalism in his palette. His earlier works were far from naturalistic, but he tended either to use a scale of values that corresponded to nature, or a more artificial scale, with at least a residual resemblance to reality. From 1964, he began to incorporate wholly non-naturalistic colors into his work. For example, he painted turquoise and pink Campbell's soup cans instead of red and white ones, and multi-tone self-portraits with blue faces and yellow hair. Such was Warhol's success during this period, that, at the opening of his exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia in 1965, 4,000 people squeezed into 2 small rooms, and the staff had to remove the paintings from the walls for security. It was an art exhibition without art. How typically Warhol. Although Warhol continued to create paintings intermittently throughout his career, in 1965 he retired from painting to concentrate on making experimental films, something he had been doing for the last few years anyway. Despite years of neglect, these films are now attracting widespread interest, and Warhol is seen as one of the most important filmmakers of the period, and a forerunner of the independent film industry. Superstar members of his factory crowd, like Edie Sedgwick, Ultraviolet, Viva, Candy Darling, and Nico, appeared in the films that he produced, and became famous in their own right. Mostly, very little happens in Warhol's movies, or so much that it is hard to keep up with. Some of his most well-known films include Sleep, which shows poet John Giorno sleeping for 6 hours, and Eat, which shows a man eating a mushroom for 45 minutes. His first financially successful, but supremely boring film was The Chelsea Girls, made in 1966. Perhaps most famous of all of his film experiments is Empire, which consisted of a view of the Empire State Building. This masterpiece was filmed from the 44th floor of the Time Life building, starting at 6 p.m. in the evening. Warhol framed the shot. The filmmakers changed the film rolls every 30 minutes, and the crew stopped filming around 1 a.m. The first 2 rolls were overexposed because Andy set the exposure incorrectly. Warhol still called the whole thing a success. "It's so beautiful," he said. "The lights come on, the stars come out, and it sways." Warhol produced nearly 650 films between 1963 and 1968. He says that he was driven by his desire to capture the ordinary experiences of living. His films are now recognized as radical explorations that go beyond the frontiers of conventional cinema. Eventually, after being attacked and shot in his factory in 1968, Warhol was no longer interested in directing films because of the oddball people and performers they attracted. Instead, he focused his efforts elsewhere. In 1970, Warhol famously withdrew all his films from circulation. This meant that critics and scholars had to write about them from memory. 14 years later, he donated all his original films to New York's Museum of Modern Art for inclusion in the Whitney Museum's Andy Warhol Film Project. Warhol was often commissioned to create vinyl record, album cover art. His first was in 1952, with The Nation's Nightmare. The recording featured a series of radio broadcasts dealing with the use of recreational drugs, a theme that would often be associated with Warhol and his entourage later on. Some of Warhol's most admired works in this genre include Diana Ross's Silk Electric, Aretha Franklin's Aretha, and John Lennon's posthumous album, Men Love Avenue. Another album cover of note was the 1971 Rolling Stones album, Sticky Fingers. This featured an image of a man's crotch in a pair of jeans, with a functioning zip. The design was nominated for a Grammy Award. The most well-known of Warhol's album covers is the 1967 Velvet Underground debut album, featuring a banana. Warhol had a complicated relationship with the women in his life. While he idolized many of his iconic muses, and they, the superstars of his factory studio, adored him, he has also been portrayed as a controlling misogynist. What is certain is that he was drawn to headstrong, unconventional and expressive women who weren't afraid to be themselves. Edie Sedgwick was one of Warhol's superstars. The daughter of a wealthy Californian rancher, Edie was raised with a healthy sense of independence and superiority that were undermined by her battles with mental health problems and eating disorders. She met Warhol at a birthday party for the playwright Tennessee Williams. Arguably, at that time, there was nobody more beautiful to Andy Warhol than Edie Sedgwick, even though the lovers he took were male. In Sedgwick, Warhol found his perfect muse. She had the kind of inherited wealth and aristocratic mannerisms that the former ad man from Pittsburgh craved. They became a sort of couple, though as far as we know, not the consummated variety. Edie appeared in no less than 18 of Warhol's films, as well as being a regular at the factory. A party wasn't considered a success unless Andy and Edie showed up together. But, as quickly as they had fallen for each other, Sedgwick and Warhol's relationship finally ended, after barely a year. At the end of 1965, she moved on, becoming infatuated with the singer Bob Dylan. Warhol was said to be devastated by what he called her betrayal. Sedgwick moved back and forth between California and New York for a while. She then became institutionalized in a mental hospital, where she met and married a fellow patient. She died of a drug overdose in 1971, at the age of 28. Whatever the truth about Edie, Warhol definitely did offer women at the factory a community and a creative freedom they struggled to find anywhere else. And, far from surrounding himself with vulnerable victims, Warhol's female superstars cast list is characterized by strong women who wouldn't have accepted a patriarchal regime. Women such as model Nico, who sang with the Velvet Underground, or Bridget Berlin, an acclaimed artist, who was part of Warhol's biggest prank, when, in 1969, he declared all of his paintings were her work. Bridget was larger-than-life proof that Warhol wasn't only interested in stereotypically beautiful women. On meeting Warhol she said, "My mother wanted me to be a slim, respectable socialite. Instead, I became an overweight troublemaker." In 1968, Andy Warhol was shot by Valerie Solonas, an unstable individual, visiting the factory. Warhol was in a very critical condition for several days after the shooting. He spent weeks in a New York hospital, recovering from his injuries, and underwent several subsequent surgeries. As a result of his injuries, he had to wear a surgical corset from then on. This traumatic event marked a major turning point in his life. Solonas was an American radical feminist and author, best known for writing the Scum Manifesto. The word scum is an acronym for Society for Cutting Up Men. She self-published the book in 1967. Solonas moved to New York City in the mid-1960s. She met Warhol and asked him to produce a play she had written. She gave him her script, which she later accused him of losing or stealing. After Solonas demanded financial compensation for the lost script, Warhol hired her to perform in a film, paying her $25. In June 1968, convinced that Warhol had tried to steal her work, Solonas bought a gun, went to the factory and shot at Warhol 3 times. The first 2 shots missed, but the third went through both lungs, his spleen, stomach, liver, and esophagus. At the same time, she also shot a visiting art critic and attempted to shoot Warhol's manager, but the gun jammed. Solonas then turned herself in to the police. She was charged with attempted murder, assault, and illegal possession of a gun. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and pleaded guilty to reckless assault with intent to harm. She served a 3-year prison sentence, including treatment in a psychiatric hospital. She died in 1988 of pneumonia in San Francisco. The attack had a profound impact on Warhol and his art. Security at the factory became much tighter from then on. For the rest of his life, Warhol lived in fear that he would be attacked again. He was also left with a dread of hospitals that ultimately took his life. He became much more guarded, abandoning much of his filmmaking and more controversial art, and focusing more on business. He founded what became known as Interview magazine in 1969. This monthly magazine, nicknamed the Crystal Ball of Pop, featured interviews with celebrities, artists, musicians, and creative thinkers. Interviews were usually unedited or edited in an eccentric fashion. Over the years, the magazine grew in circulation and required more of his time. Initially established as a film journal, Interview magazine changed direction in 1972, covering fashion, interiors and, above all, famous people. In doing so, it defined a new template for popular magazines, and one whose slick nonchalance stood in stark contrast to other magazines of the time. In the early days, complimentary copies of Interview were often given away to the in-crowd. This was at the start of the magazine's circulation. Toward the end of his life, Warhol withdrew from everyday oversight of his magazine, and a more conventional editorial style was introduced under a new editor. Warhol continued to act as ambassador for the magazine, distributing issues to passers-by, and creating ad hoc signing events on the streets of New York. Warhol, who clearly relished his celebrity status, was a regular at Studio 54, a famous New York disco, along with other celebrities such as Liza Minnelli, Bianca Jagger and fashion designer Halston. Commenting on celebrity fixation, his own, and that of the public at large, Warhol observed, "More than anything, people just want stars." In 1972, Warhol painted one of the greatest so-called protest paintings ever made. Vote McGovern, 1972, raised $40,000 for the George McGovern presidential campaign. It is an ugly picture of Richard Nixon, a president, as a gargoyle. After this portrait, Warhol, as well as other artists involved with the McGovern campaign, including Robert Rauschenberg, Terry Southern, and Norman Mailer, were audited by the U.S. Inland Revenue Service. Warhol was audited thereafter until he died. During the early 1970s, Warhol rekindled his interest in painting, with a series of society portraits, as well as pictures of the Chinese Communist Party leader, Mao Zedong. Warhol's paintings of Mao, created soon after Richard Nixon visited China, amused wealthy art collectors, and supported their view of the superiority of Western capitalism by showing the supposed champion of world revolution as a consumer product for rich Americans. The Mao series of screen prints is based on the official portrait of Mao shown on the cover of Mao's Little Red Book, which was considered at the time to be the cornerstone of Maoist ideology. In each image, Mao's face is colored dramatically, his lips, sometimes rouge red. In many instances, Mao appears to be wearing makeup. His mole, darkly colored, as a beauty mark, similar to that of Marilyn Monroe. Producing the screen prints in multiple versions and colors, as Warhol did, is a reminder of the mass-produced propaganda posters which were widely displayed in China under Mao's rule. The creation of these portraits resulted in Mao becoming a pop icon in the West, just like Warhol's other celebrity portraits. Warhol eventually visited China in 1982 and marked the visit with this famous photograph of him standing before Mao's portrait in Tiananmen Square. By mid-1969, Warhol's involvement in fine art had largely dried up. As one of Warhol's studio assistants was quoted as saying, "I've been doing it all for the last year and a half. Andy doesn't do art anymore. He's bored with it." And it was largely true. Warhol's important accomplishment during this period was his reinvention of the society portrait, it now became the primary focus of his painting efforts. He received hundreds of commissions from wealthy socialites, musicians, and film stars. No one knows how many he painted. He saw it as an overall portrait of society. It is said that the going rate for commissioning one was $25,000. The format was based on a Polaroid camera image. The selected picture was enlarged, transferred to silk screen and then printed. Warhol would sometimes subject them to his own kind of plastic surgery, bringing features out, or collaging elements in. The Times newspaper panned the works as shallow and boring, while one critic said the works hardly exist within the sphere of aesthetic debate. Warhol was appreciated far more for his works on canvas than his photographic pursuits. His art is valued with respect to his paintings, regardless of the fact that most of them, if not all, were directly derived from photographs. So, even though the canvases are classified as paintings, most of them were never a product of a traditional painting process. From the 1970s, until his death, Warhol made tens of thousands of Polaroid prints, which served as working studies for his commissioned society portraits. However, many were never made into silkscreens, but remained experimental, intimate prints that the artist preserved in his personal files. Among these was a series of self-portraits, in drag, made by Warhol and another photographer, in the early 1980s. Warhol's photographs of the celebrities that marked the popular culture of the 70s and the 80s are said by some to be somewhere between art and obsessive collecting. But it is good that he did, as we have a chance to see a part of the history of New York City and the good life, as it used to be in the recent past. Warhol's childhood illness resulted in the loss of the pigmentation in his skin, which remained blotchy and pallid throughout his life. His complexion, coupled with a big nose, rapidly thinning hair and slim build, made Warhol desperately insecure about his looks and sexuality. In the 50s he began using clothing, wigs and cosmetics to mask his face and body. In 1957, he had plastic surgery to change the shape of his nose. By the 80s, Warhol had a near-daily exercise regime, and took vitamin supplements to improve his hair and skin, and a daily amphetamine diet pill to control his weight. Many identify Warhol by his trademark wig, a grey to silver contraption that sat uneasily on his head. The first wig was a mousy brown, but he moved into yellow blonde, then platinum, and ultimately settled on shades of grey and silver. In his self-portraits, Warhol often exaggerated, transformed or disguised himself, so that the images became caricatures of his real face. In this self-portrait, with fright wig, his ghostly head is isolated from his body by his dark clothing, making it appear almost afloat against the dark background. He wears a silver wig, which he often used in his range of disguises. The wig hair is wild and messy, while his blankly staring eyes look straight ahead. This self-portrait is one of the last of a series that Warhol completed before his death in 1987. By the time Warhol produced these works, he had become a celebrity in his own right, much like the icons he featured in numerous other portraits that he made during his career. Andy Warhol died on February 22, 1987, of a heart attack after undergoing routine gallbladder surgery. Only immediate family and friends were present at the funeral. He is buried next to his mother and father at St. John the Baptist Byzantine Catholic Cemetery in Bethel Park, Pittsburgh. A memorial service was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, in Pittsburgh. 2,000 people turned out to say goodbye. The Warhol Foundation for the Arts was established from his estate, and, in 1994, the Andy Warhol Museum opened in Pittsburgh. It is the largest museum dedicated to the artwork of a single artist in the United States. At the time of Warhol's death, his net worth was $220 million. 30 years after his death, Warhol is one of the world's most famous artists, not to mention the most lucrative, with his work accounting for 15% of all contemporary art sales in the United States at this time. The Andy Monument was unveiled in 2011, near Warhol's factory in Union Square, New York City. The 10-foot-tall sculpture is chrome-plated, and shows Warhol with a Polaroid camera around his neck.